The sharp chemical smell hit me before I saw the first ruined bloom, a thin metallic note that blew through the yard like a cruel private bell. At first I thought the sprinklers had kicked on, some sleepy garden system misfiring in the grey light. But then I saw her, Constance Whitmore, standing amid Sarah's climbing roses with one of those cheap plastic spray bottles, the kind you buy for weeds and think nothing of, except she was using it like an executioner's tool. The hiss of that nozzle was a guttural punctuation to a life stitched with softer sounds. Sarah's humming at dawn, the gentle snip of pruning shears, the little laugh she gave when a new bud finally opened. Each bush in that bed had a name Sarah had given it in some private, foolish ritual, the kind only two people who'd loved and lost keep. Grace, Mercy Little Red, Zara's Dawn. I heard a sound that wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a memory being erased. Constance looked up when I stepped into the yard, and there was that same brittle, practiced smile. The smile of someone used to being obeyed. "Morning, Thad," she sang, as if she were apologizing for nothing. "Pest control." Her perfumed breath rolled over the air like a dare. I moved closer, and the scent of bleach and herbicide made my eyes sting. She pumped the bottle again, and a fine mist settled over the petals. A millimeter at a time, a red bloom went slack, its edges curling like paper left too long in a book. I wanted to stop her, to wrest the bottle out of her hands, but something larger than anger rose first. Grief, hot and raw, the kind of grief that doesn't make noise so much as hollow you out. I pressed my palm to the cold iron of Sarah's hand-painted mailbox that morning, her brushstrokes worn by years and storms. And the smallest, most ordinary thing felt like an accusation. "She's a nuisance to the neighborhood," Constance said, like she was describing dust on a windowsill. "Those roses attract bees. They're a hazard." The ridiculousness of it should have been laughable. Mrs. Peterson, whom Constance used as a rationale for every petty outrage, hadn't left her house in months. It was theatre, and everyone except me knew it. Still, watching those petals falter under a stranger's contempt felt like being present at a little death. When she left, she walked away too briskly, as if she'd done my garden a favour. The evening settled, and I found myself kneeling in the dirt long after the neighbours' lamps blinked off. My fingers dug into the earth where Sarah had once planted each root by name, where she'd murmured nonsense to coax new life. Dirt under fingernails, old ads of autumn and teacups stacked in the sink. Those small reliquaries of living felt suddenly unreal. That night, I stitched together a decision from grief and calculation. I would not let this pass as a petty neighbourhood spat. I had been a prosecutor when it mattered, and I knew the language of evidence, the contours of proof. If Constance wanted to make war of my sorrow, then I'd marshal law like a shield for the people she'd preyed on. The security system went up 2 days later. 6 cameras, motion triggers, night vision, the whole cathedral of intrusion detection. Call it overkill. Call it a man trying to wrest small control back into his life. I called the sheriff first, then the clerk, then packed a folder of photographs and the first filed complaint. The footage arrived in midnight green when the first motion alert pinged my phone. Constance, the botanical assassin, in black clothing under the moon, methodical and slow, kneeling and pouring industrial-strength herbicide onto root crowns, while humming a tune I recognized as someone else's lullaby. She left behind fake notices tucked under rocks and subterfuge that read like a dossier. A fabricated vote, a fake signature from Mrs. Lucy, who could barely write her own name, a phony ordinance claiming emergency landscape remediation. The police report should have followed with an arrest. Instead, the system groaned. The man at the station who should have looked me in the eye and said, "We'll handle it," looked down at his coffee and then at me and suggested grief counselling. Constance had already woven herself into the bureaucracy. She'd made the institutions too small to serve justice without first being pried open. That was the pattern. All the ugly little escalations designed to break people quietly. Towing a visiting relative's car at dawn with fake signage. Phony fines that bled savings into Constance's private accounts. False safety complaints that prompted intrusive visits into a house at all hours. She targeted those she read as vulnerable. Single parents, elderly neighbours, anyone whose life had the soft edge of a wound. I realised then that the garden was only the first casualty. Her aggression was a map to an entire fraud. I began to document everything. The dead roses, the night footage, the fake invoices, the neighbours' stories. I sat at kitchen tables that filled with more than rosemary and coffee. They filled with pain, Yes, but also with names and dates and receipts, and the tiny bureaucratic breadcrumbs Constance had left behind. It took time. It took a patience I'd cultivated in courtrooms where an eager prosecutor learns to wait for the case to be perfect. No chance for motion to be dismissed on technicality. I made calls to the people who could follow tax trails and wire transfers. I asked former colleagues for help, because sometimes the law is a ladder you must climb with others. Forensic accountants who could find phantom community funds tucked into shell accounts, federal investigators who could listen to taped calls and connect the thin, poisonous threads Constance used as justification for theft, civil rights lawyers who read patterns and knew when to say, "There's intent here." When the FBI came, it was not a small, dark-suited visit. It was the sort of presence that rearranged a neighborhood's balance of power. Agents pored over bank statements showing $300,000 pulled from residents, invoices for services never performed, and the same name routing payments into the very accounts registered in Constance's alias. Neighbors began to tell me their stories, how she'd threatened to call immigration on a foreign-born grandson, how she'd made a single mother choose between paying a safety fee or losing custody, threats thinly veiled as concern, how she'd relied on a local cop's complicity to keep the harassment running like a small machine. With each testimony, each bank record, the shape of Constance's scheme became clear. The HOA facade was a tool, not a community. The roses had been a symbol and a warning. Destroying what she couldn't have, what she resented, was her way of flexing control into the ordinary lives of others. When the arrest came, it felt like winter sun after a long night, not because the flames of vengeance had been lit, but because the machinery of justice, slow and clumsy, had finally geared into motion. Agents moved precisely, carefully, the way people who work to undo organized harm must. Evidence we had collected over weeks, phone records, forged documents, proof of money transfers, was enough to secure search warrants. They found ledger books behind a false wall in her home office. They uncovered transfers into a shell non-profit she controlled. Records of cash withdrawals timed to the day notices were delivered. When they took her away, she was still wearing pearl studs and that same exact smile. But the smirk was brittle now. For the first time, the smile had to hide the machine that had kept her alive. The accounts, the invoices, the little men who towed cars at dawn for cash. Derek, her cousin, flipped quickly once confronted with a pile of fingerprints on canisters and a credit card receipt tied to the same Home Depot purchases he had made under his own name. Confessions followed like a chain reaction. One link pulled, the others revealed. Sitting in the glow of my kitchen lights with my daughter asleep against my shoulder, I let the relief lap over me like warmed soup. Nothing could put those roses back in place. Nothing could regrow Sarah's hand-painted number on the mailbox, just as she had finished it the week she went into radiation. The physical losses remained, and the ache did not leave like a courthouse echo. But the prosecution that followed, mail fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy to commit extortion, was the legal response necessary to limit the harm and to set a public standard. You cannot weaponize neighborhood kindness and call it authority. The hearings that came later were exhaustive. The kind of slow moral algebra where every invoice, every tape, every whispered threat filed in a notebook had to be shown and proved. In court, we laid out the pattern. The roses, the fake notices, the towed cars, the fraudulent accounts. We brought in the neighbors whose cheeks flushed as they told the truth out loud. And in those small confessions, I paid because I was afraid. There was an honest, healing kind of bravery. Constance sat through it all with the same unreadable face, but the witness statements worked like little lamps set to light a dark room. People who had been cowed for months came forward and told the court how they'd been shamed and told lies and forced into payments. Victim after victim spoke not just to their losses, but to the fear of speaking out when the system seemed to shelter the predator. That fear unraveled under oath. When the jury returned its verdict, guilty on multiple counts, the room didn't cheer. There was no gloating. There was instead a quiet, almost stunned reconciliation. Justice, in its best moments, is not about obliteration. It's about repair. The penalties were steep. Federal fines, restitution orders, prison time. And they were also, crucially, a legal acknowledgement that people like Constance cannot privatize cruelty. On the day of sentencing, I brought a small photograph to see. When the sentence was handed down, the sound that filled the courtroom was not applause or relief. It was silence, the kind of silence that comes after thunder, when the air itself seems to be waiting to see what survives. Constance Whitmore stood there, the weight of the verdict settling over her like invisible dust. For so long she had spoken in the clipped tones of authority, every word a command disguised as civic duty. But that morning she could not find a single syllable to carry her pride. Her lawyer shifted beside her, flipping pages that no longer mattered. The judge's voice was even, controlled, merciful in its restraint, but I could hear the subtext. You did this. You used power to wound, and now you must face what power cannot save you from consequence. Outside, the day was a pale wash of light. Reporters hovered at the steps, their microphones like antennae searching for outrage. But the neighbors who had gathered there didn't shout. They stood shoulder to shoulder, an accidental community forged out of one woman's cruelty. I walked through them slowly, meeting eyes, shaking hands. Some of them were people I'd barely known before the scandal, people I had waved to without ever learning their names. But now we were bound by a shared trial, literal and emotional. The woman with the oxygen tank who had once been fined for her garden angels was there. The retired music teacher whose mailbox Constance had painted over stood beside her. They all came to say thank you, but it wasn't me they were thanking. It was the fact that someone had listened, that the law had finally looked back and seen them. When I got home that evening, the house was quiet again. For months it had been filled with investigators, reporters, lawyers, the sound of printers, and the occasional sob when a neighbor realized just how deep the deception ran. Now it was only me and the faint scent of soil that clung to the air, even though the garden outside was bare. I stepped out onto the porch and looked at the patch where Sarah's roses had once been. It was a scar now, just dark earth pressed flat under months of rain. But in that wound there was a strange kind of peace. I knelt, pressing my palm into the dirt, feeling its temperature, the weight of the world it carried. We'll start again, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I meant the garden or myself. The following weeks became a quiet reconstruction. The HOA was dissolved by court order, its assets frozen, and a temporary committee was appointed to manage what was left of the neighborhood's infrastructure. It was strange watching something that had once felt tyrannical shrink back into something ordinary. Meetings in garages, minutes taken on notepads, people bringing cookies instead of threats. There was laughter again, uncertain at first, but laughter nonetheless. Children began to ride their bikes without being chased down for violating noise regulations. Someone repainted the community pool gate a cheerful yellow. Life, cautious but persistent, returned. I spent my mornings tending the soil, more meditation than labor. I didn't plant anything right away. For a while, I just watched the sunlight move across the patch where the roses had died. Every dawn felt like a small conversation between grief and patience. Eventually, though, I began to dig new beds. First for wildflowers, then lavender, then a few heirloom roses I ordered from a small nursery 3 states away. They arrived in cardboard boxes that smelled faintly of life and promise. My daughter helped me unpack them. She was only 7, but she handled the fragile stems with a reverence that made me ache. "Which one is Mummy's?" she asked softly, and I pointed to a small pale pink hybrid I had chosen for Sarah. We named it Resilience. Word spread. One by one, neighbors started planting too. Not out of pity, but in solidarity. Mrs. Peterson, who had barely left her house during Constance's reign, asked me to dig her a small bed for daisies. The music teacher planted tulips in mismatched rows. Even the local mechanic, who used to keep to himself, brought over a bag of sunflower seeds. On Saturday mornings, the whole block smelled of earth and coffee. We talked about everything and nothing, recipes, kids, the weather. But underneath it all was an unspoken understanding. We had all been afraid once, and now we weren't. A few months later, I got a call from the prosecutor's office. The restitution funds recovered from Constance's accounts were to be distributed among the victims. My share, though small, was enough to repair the fence and replace the mailbox Sarah had painted. I could have taken it as a cold victory, a ledger balancing, but instead I decided to use it differently. I called a local artist, one of the teenagers who had testified about being fined for his mural, and asked him to paint something on the new mailbox. "Something that feels like beginning," I told him. A week later, he arrived with cans of paint and a steady hand. When he was done, there was a sunrise on the metal, bold, imperfect, alive. The number was there too, but smaller now. secondary to the light. It was the first time since Sarah's death that the house felt like a home again. The garden bloomed late that year. The first rose opened on a Tuesday morning in April, soft as breath. I called my daughter out to see it, and she clapped, her eyes wide. "It smells like her," she said. I bent down, inhaled, and for a fleeting second, I almost believed in ghosts. Maybe not the haunting kind, but the kind that linger in scent and soil, in habits carried on without thought. I whispered a thank you into the petals, not to anyone specific, just to the universe for letting me reach this quiet place. Constance's sentencing made national news for a day or two. There were headlines about HOA tyrant exposed and neighborhood fraud uncovered. But by the next week, the cycle had moved on to something else. For most people, it was just another scandal. For us, it was a reckoning. The day she was transferred to the state facility, I received a letter. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Neat, looping, every letter practiced. It read, "You destroyed me. I hope you're satisfied." I stared at it for a long time, not angry, not gloating, just sad. Because in her own way, Constance had been a victim of the same things she inflicted on others. Loneliness. Power for her had been a substitute for belonging, and now she had neither. I didn't reply. Instead, I folded the letter, placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, and went back to the garden. The sun was low, turning everything gold. I realized then that justice isn't a single event. It's a process, a daily act of choosing to live differently than the people who wronged you. It's weeding, pruning, replanting. It's forgiving, not to absolve the guilty, but to free yourself from the orbit of their damage. Months rolled by, then seasons. The community transformed in ways I hadn't imagined. The HOA meetings evolved into neighborhood dinners. Instead of fines, we shared tools and time. Someone suggested turning the vacant lot, the one Constance had tried to sell illegally, into a community garden. It felt poetic, so we did. The first day we gathered there, tools in hand, the soil still smelled faintly of ash and fertilizer, but the laughter was louder. Children ran through the rows, tagging each other with streaks of mud. Someone brought a speaker and played soft jazz. There were no rules posted on the gate, only a hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome, all hands welcome." One evening, as the sun slipped behind the maple trees, I stood at the edge of that new garden and watched my daughter chase fireflies with the same children who had once been told not to play outside after dark. The air was warm, heavy with the perfume of blooms. For the first time in a long while, I felt a kind of gratitude that didn't carry guilt. The past hadn't vanished. The pain was still there, quiet but present, like the hum beneath a song. Yet in its place had grown something softer, stronger, a community bound by empathy instead of fear. Later that night, I sat on the porch with an old photo album in my lap. Sarah's handwriting curled across the captions, tiny, cheerful comments under each picture of a flower or a backyard barbecue. I traced them with my thumb and realized I was no longer looking for closure. I already had it. It lived in every laugh that echoed down the street, in every neighbor who waved from their yard, in every child who grew up believing that kindness was a form of strength. The garden had taught me that loss doesn't end a story. It simply changes its shape. The following spring, we hosted what the community jokingly called the Rebirth Festival. Tables lined the cul-de-sac, covered in homemade pies and mason jars of lemonade. There was music, color, even a raffle to raise funds for local charities. The mayor came to shake hands and take photos, but the real moment belonged to the people who had endured. I was asked to say a few words, though I'm not much for speeches. I stood under a makeshift canopy of fairy lights and told them the truth, that we'd all been broken once, that sometimes it takes being stripped bare for something genuine to grow. Sarah used to say, I told them, that gardens are proof that hope doesn't die. It just waits underground. The crowd was quiet for a heartbeat, and then applause rippled through like wind through leaves. After everyone left, I lingered by the roses. The moonlight turned them silver. I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the trial, the rebuilding, and it all felt distant now, like a story that had finally found its ending. Maybe that's what healing is. Not forgetting, but retelling the past in a way that lets you keep living. I reached down and brushed a petal between my fingers. It was smooth, delicate, alive. "We made it," I whispered. Inside, my daughter slept beneath.